there are people with higher needs that absolutely can do a great job, but they need more support. It might cost more money. You might need to have those harder conversations more frequently. All of those larger pieces that maybe you don't think are helpful to your bottom line, but in the end, what if they're great innovators and they make you a product that makes you $1 million?
This is Humble Mind. We are a social learning community that shares a passion for connection, conversation, and learning about the future. And this is our podcast. Check out more about what we do at join.humblemind.co for more. I'm Alex Searle, and today we're going to be speaking about how to have difficult conversations. Now, how many times have you found yourself having the right kind of discussion with a colleague or friend, maybe a partner, a parent, a child, but maybe with the wrong tools? We can all have the best of intentions, but the language we use can tell a totally different story. And when we're dealing with someone who might be neurodivergent or different to ourselves in some way, it's easy to leave out the compassion part. This can have massively disturbing consequences, from our relationships to how we even shape society at large. So today we're looking at how to equip ourselves with better tools. And joining us is Linea Johnson. She's a mental health advocate, she's a speaker, and the co-author of a book called Perfect Chaos. It's a memoir that explores her own journey with bipolar disorder. Through her own professional and personal experiences, Linea has become quite a powerful voice for mental health, disability rights, creating inclusive spaces that honor neurodiversity in leadership, in work, and in culture. So really happy to have you on the podcast with us today, Linea.
I'm so happy to be here. I think it's such an important thing to be able to talk about language and how we can communicate and interact in a better way with one another.
Yes, absolutely. As people who follow the podcast and in the community know, I have a huge passion for language and for words as a way to create meaning, to excite us, to communicate information, obviously, to make sense of the world. But I'm keen to learn from you about how we can see it as a tool to help us have the kinds of conversations that maybe we're not having or not having in the right way, and we can get into that. But maybe as a way to start, is there a sort of a good working definition that you can help me with when we're thinking of what it is to be neurodivergent? What is neurodivergence?
Absolutely. So first, neurodiversity is kind of all of us. And within that, neurodivergent, our brains might be a little different than what we have as the normative. So within that umbrella, we might see people that have ADHD or autism. I live with bipolar disorder. And then we have neurotypical, which may be people that have different brains. So it's trying to have this inclusive space where we can acknowledge the different types of brains that we all live with. And what I like about it is it steps a little bit away from that medical diagnostic model in thinking about our brains and just what our different needs are, how we interact differently, how we want to make connections and the things we're interested in.
So it's interesting because we're talking about something that happens in the brain, a physical, change that makes our experience of the world different, and that would be called, me having some kind of neurodivergent trait of some kind. But at the same time, we're wanting to understand that in an inclusive way, where that person doesn't necessarily feel sidelined or that they're different in a negative way. Through usage of the words, and we can get into that. But can you point out maybe just a couple other examples of some neurodiversity that is commonplace? You mentioned ADHD. You talked about ADHD, bipolar disorder. What are some other ones that are useful to think about?
People with autism might fall into this. People that live with OCD or obsessive compulsive disorder, schizophrenia, PTSD. So even within the neurodiverse spectrum, we all have very different brains. Even folks that have bipolar, we all have very different brains. So for me, it's this really wonderful way of honoring our differences and kind of the wonderful pieces of it, while acknowledging that there might be things that we need that are different, that we might have different ways that we could interact in the world that help us versus the way the world has been set up.
Right. Absolutely. So looking into that, how the world has been set up, I saw a statistic earlier. Maybe this is a common one that you already know, but up to 20% of people have brains that develop or work in a slightly different way. And like you said, there's a massive spectrum of what that might be. That's huge. That's not like, a sort of a small minority of cases, 3 or 4%, but that's 1 in every 5 people. So when we're looking at, let's say, workplace cultures, especially in high performance workplaces where, you're part of a team, you're needing to deliver results every single day, you're expected to work extremely long hours, vacation time, family, what's that? In the traditional kind of, workplace in the way that it's been set up, as you said. Can you sketch me a picture of how that kind of place currently is hosting, that team, and thinking about that team having 5 people, one of those people have a brain that works differently, and they're experiencing that workplace differently. Maybe you can just talk a bit about what that normally looks like and how that might affect everyone, that person and also the team around them.
Absolutely. So I think even going back to how workplaces were set up with the 9 to 5, right? And that it was meant for productivity, it was meant for us. And when we think about knowledge workers, people that sit at a desk, that work at a computer, it was set up with this productivity in mind. And it's kind of gone on hyperdrive. I think that COVID, we sit at desks and we're almost not even productive anymore. We're just pseudo productive, as I've heard it say.
Yeah.
We have this feeling that people are always looking over our shoulder. We need to email back immediately. We need to be in 100 meetings. So it's honestly not good for any of us, right? We're not getting as much work done as we want to because we're in meetings, we're emailing and talking about talking. We're meeting about meeting. So if you have this group of 4 or 5 people and one person is neurodiverse, one thing I really love thinking about is within the disability framework, thinking of what's called universal design and inclusive design. And it's this idea that when you can design for different disabilities or different accommodations or accessibility needs, it's actually helpful for everyone. So you may have someone like me that if I'm really anxious, I have a hard time focusing, or if I'm depressed, maybe my memory isn't as good. And so I have these tools that I can put in place for myself, whether that's a system to keep track of notes or a focus thing on my computer so that I don't have things dinging all the time. But what really is helpful is for that rest of that team to realize, oh, these tools can be really helpful for me as well. And acknowledging that we all have, whether neurodiverse or not, we all have different ways of working. We all have needs. And I think that we're in this exciting time where we're finally acknowledging, if we talk about these things, we can develop these tools and ways of working that maybe are healthier for all of us.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can see that as something that would be applicable to me or to anyone who would want to shake off, the traditional ways of looking at productivity and how we approach working. I think you were talking about pseudo productivity. If it's coming from the book I think it's coming from, which is Cal Newport, the Slow Productivity. Have you read it? Yeah, it's awesome.
I have, yeah.
Yeah, and he talks so much about that, and you're kind of flipping through the pages, and some of it's like, oh my God, this is ridiculous. But I do these things too, kind of mindlessly scrolling through Slack or, just looking at a mountain of emails. And yeah, there really is something to be said about rethinking kind of what we think is productive versus I think what he talks about, which is just looking productive, the activity of trying to seem productive in order to satisfy a boss or some kind of other irrelevant metric. There's really a case to be made for that.
And I want to go back and I want to ensure that I'm not just glossing over that there are very specific needs that people might need accommodations for. Like me as someone with bipolar, I don't want to say it's this thing that if we fix it for everyone, that there are reasons that in America we have the American Disability Act, that there are policies around mental health. There is a lot of discrimination. There is a lot of services that are lacking and resources that are lacking. So I just want to acknowledge and not gloss over that fact either. But I do think that I'm seeing a positive change where we're starting to talk about it more. And I think that it's positive, but it's also making me a little bit worried because I think because it is becoming something we talk about so much, it's almost like we are using these psychological terms in a way it's almost like we're missing what they actually are meant to be or why they were developed, and it oversimplifies or dilutes, what they can actually be talking about. This misuse of psychological terms.
Yes. Okay. Well, let's get into that because I'm coming into this conversation very much, as an open book, an open mind. I want to learn for myself because I'm sure there's, little kind of mistakes in my, in what I say or certain questions that might not be sensitive to people who I know well, but I'm not reflect that in the language I use. So is there a sort of a toolkit or a kind of a way to sort of approach that? Because at the same time, I'm also aware that sometimes going in with too much of the eggshells, also doesn't allow us to kind of get to the meat of any particular situation or doesn't allow us to collaborate effectively in a team where, okay, I hear what you're going through, or I hear that you might be different or you have different needs, and that's totally fine. But we also need to perform and we need to work and we need to get things done. And, so how is there a helpful way to navigate that or think about that?
Yes, absolutely. And I think the biggest thing is listening and active listening, like really not listening to talk, listening to take it all in, to learn, and then if it's appropriate to respond, to respond. And I think we get stuck in this thing where maybe we're excited about a conversation or maybe we're in the midst of work where we're not really listening to one another. We're not really learning what people's needs are. So I think active listening and then asking the question around people's preferences, around, building this safe space where people feel like they can bring it up if, I don't really like this word, or, I think that we found each other on LinkedIn because there was a post that was about, what was it? I think the high value person or something.
Yeah.
And so being able to have a conversation where I could say, I don't feel like high value might be the right term for this. I see what the larger goal is, and it doesn't seem to line up with this inclusive thing you're describing when we think about, placing someone at higher value. So it's about conversations and listening and being a little brave. To ask questions and connect as humans and know that we're not going to be perfect, that unfortunately there will be missteps. We're never going to know everything. That's one of the most difficult, uncomfortable pieces, but that's how we can connect as humans.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Are there any other kind of maybe just looking into the language side of things, because so much of it is about what you say versus what you might mean. Like I said in the beginning, you might have good intentions, but you end up using different words, different phrases that you are, using them in a perfectly innocent way because you think there's nothing attached to it, but then that comes off to that particular person as offensive or as not helpful, or perhaps it puts them in a box in some way. Are there certain ways that you can think about, sharing how to deal with what I'm really asking is kind of like, what phrases or what kind of like, what is the structure of certain words or certain phrases, certain things that affect our mental health, but the other person might not know that. Is there a pattern between that? Or is it all kind of cultural and random?
I think that I think one pattern that I see is kind of value-based words. And that was, like I was saying, the high value person, but also I have an eating disorder as well. So putting value around diets and being a good person is now gotten tied into our diets or tied into our productivity. So I think really trying to step back from maybe words that we're used to just, colloquial terms or jargon, and asking where did this start from? There's a lot of words that are actually have racist origins that we use commonly but have no idea. And so reminding ourselves, where does this word come from? When I think about a master bedroom, why do we use the word master? And it's a lot of work to keep asking yourself those questions. But I think for me, that's one thing that I've tried to be aware of is almost that thing where I'm looking into words. And then when you're using words that might have a specific origin, such as psychological words, triggered, narcissist, I'm trying to think of like gaslighting, and we're using these words without fully understanding the context where they come from, that's when they start to be, kind of separated from what their actual meaning is, using things like bipolar weather or mental illness as a metaphor. So remembering, I think, the power of words and the definitions and where they came from. Again, that's a lot of work, and I don't know if that's the quick answer.
Yeah. Do you think it just in a kind of a thinking back to our workplace setting, do you think that it kind of falls, or the responsibility to remind someone, it falls on the person who takes issue with a particular word, to be able to gently remind the person, or to kind of maybe take that opportunity to re-educate the other person and say, look, that word has a racist origin, or the phrase you're using, I don't think it's what you mean, but here's maybe what you do mean, kind of the opportunity to re-educate? Or does it fall on the other person to kind of know that from the start? Or is it both?
Well, you can't know what you don't know. So if you don't know in the first place, but we also have to recognize that there's a lot of power structures and trauma, and we don't necessarily want people who have had a history of being discriminated and traumatized to have to be the ones changing the system. So I actually think that it's kind of all of the things, but I think that leadership, and we need to think about the workplace as a whole. One of the big things that I do in my talks about workplace mental health is thinking about it from a system-wide change. We can have someone come in and do a talk. I can go in and I can give a talk on inclusive language, do an hour-long talk. But then what? Are we implementing it into our policies? Are we implementing it into our culture? How is HR or how our leadership making sure that we build this into part of the culture? And I think that's where we need to start thinking about these things. Have someone like an advisor, or if you have an inclusion specialist that can come in and provide guidance, but it needs to be baked into everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Baked into the system from top down. Well, let's talk a bit about leadership, because that's where it all starts. That's where all great change can be inspired from. At the same time, I've seen a lot of great leaders who take pride in sort of leading from the back. They don't kind of lead from the front necessarily, even though you've got great leaders that do that, but they're happy to sort of build consensus and take a bigger view on things, and really focus on the baking in part that you talked about. Is maybe you can provide some examples or some good leaders who you've seen who've been successful in establishing that kind of culture, and not just when the consultant comes in and has a chat with them, but when no one's looking? Are there some good stories or some good things you've seen that have worked?
Yeah, I had a company I was working at that they just did such a good job. My two leaders, they were so good at being soft and hard at the same time. So they had such care and such connection to their emotions, but they also could step up and take care of business when they needed to. And one of the things that we did was called safety net. And so at the beginning of a meeting, we would have everyone go around and kind of say what they need the room to know so that we can have a conversation that's productive. For example, I want you to know, and this is just as an example, I want everyone to know that I am really grumpy today because my commute in was horrible. And so if I sound aggressive when I'm responding, it might have nothing to do with this meeting. It might be, from my commute. Or I want people to know that I'm really struggling right now with depression. And so if I seem like I'm not focusing, it's not because you're boring me, and it doesn't have to be that vulnerable, but having that was so helpful for our team to connect and know that we're all humans, and to give that benefit of a doubt, and that the leader was really, practicing this inclusive piece, that they really wanted to put that into action in every meeting.
Have you seen leaders work, or certain, maybe even not necessarily leaders, but just the cultural dynamics of teams where there's a stressful environment that they work in, like we said earlier, high performance, there's massive deadlines, they've got to deliver. And I would imagine that a lot of the time, I think in my own experience I've seen this as well, when the going gets tough, that's often when what could be considered the niceties fall away, the kinds of things that we normally make time for, to check in with each other, to have drinks on a Friday, whatever it might be. Those things will just fall away because we've got to grind. I'm interested to sort of dive into your thinking around where these things can be applied when it's hard to apply them. Because it's fine if you're hungry and you're sitting in a restaurant, right? You can just order, no problem. But if you're sitting in the middle of a subway, or if you're in the middle of, of the desert, then you've got to come up with different ways to get that, right? Like, yeah, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I worked for a while as a change manager, and it was very high stress. We're talking about whether people are going to be laid off, and acquisitions and big changes within the organization. And so many things flying at you. There's uncertainty about your job. If you keep your job, what's going to look like? And even within that, I think taking those very brief moments of a check-in in the beginning, just check in where people are at, check in where their workload is at. It doesn't need to be take over the whole meeting, but if you can find those instances, those little kinks along the line that are holding you back, and you can resolve them up front, then it doesn't just keep building. So we can say, oh, so-and-so is really struggling because essentially they're struggling with this piece of the technology. And instead of letting it build up, if we can just acknowledge it and fix it right away, that's not going to heighten their anxiety and the depression, and then their relationships get bad. So having those little 5-minute check-ins, even making time to take care of it up front instead of letting it grow and become a big thing where maybe a client is coming in at the end with an issue.
Yeah, I think the challenge that people face, especially in those more difficult situations or where there's higher pressure, is that you still have to try and maintain an environment of psychological safety in some way, no matter how hard it's going to get, or we've got a busy day or a busy few months ahead of us, or maybe even worse, there's an existential crisis. And if we don't perform over the next 3 months, you're all going to lose your jobs, right? Even that never mind whatever else, is a massive burden to kind of carry, and then still to be expected to perform to reverse those fortunes is really tough.
And I think the problem that sometimes we get in is that that's when a leader might bring in someone to do yoga over lunch or have like a breathing time. But I think that it's more those little moments of even in the walking in the hall that we can just check in and say, hey, is there anything I can do for you? Is there anything that you're struggling with that we can resolve? I think those have so much more impact than having, a one-off yoga. Not that that's not great, because having moments like that are great. But as I said, it's baking it into the culture. It's doing those. I know it's harder, but it's almost like working harder will make it easier eventually.
I'm thinking back to someone who used to say they used to have a kind of almost like a catchphrase in as part of a team that I used to work in, and he used to always say, "My door's always open," and it's a great image. It's a nice, reassuring thing to hear, especially when you don't have a problem or an issue. You don't have a reason to walk through the door. Then great, nice to hear that. It's a facility that I have in case the going gets tough. And I remember through a different situation when I actually needed to talk to him, and I walked through the door literally. Then he very quickly, maybe it was just a bad day, I don't know, but there was it was as if he never said that. It was I just don't have time for you right now. And I would assume that a lot of people maybe feel that way, where they can walk past the boss, or they can walk past, people in the corridor, around the water cooler, and they can say, "Hey, checking in, everything all right? Okay, cool." Because it does only take 5 seconds, and perhaps 90% of the time that's all you need, and everything is okay. Great, thanks for checking in. But whoa, if I actually do need you, and I do need you to listen, I think there's a sense in which sometimes, now I'm actually going to have to do the work and listen to you. And now I'm actually going to have to step in here instead of just being comfortable with saying it and saying that my door is always open, until you need to walk through it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's being a true leader, is someone that you figure out the time. If you're going to say that, then you're going to need to follow through, because those actions speak louder than words. And you can set up boundaries and say, "Hey, I'm in the midst of this really time sensitive thing. Can you check back at this time?" There's no problem with that, because you're acknowledging, "Hey, I see you. I can't acknowledge you right this second. I have my own struggles." It makes you human. And then, but I always think my mom was a teacher and a special education professor growing up. And she always was told teachers, ask the questions, but then be prepared for the answers. Because sometimes if you're asking kids with a mental health condition, is everything okay at home? Or do you feel like hurting yourself? Sometimes you get those answers that you're going to have to deal with and you're going to have to be ready for. So as a leader, you got to build that part as well. So being that active listener and having what you need in the background to prepare you if this is to happen. Oh, I know who to go to in HR. Well, I know who to go to in IT, having that prepared.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's look at mental health for a moment. I have a friend who runs a company that's very successful. She works with executives around the world, with sort of mental fitness as the focus for teams and executive teams, especially around kind of trying to look at productivity and kind of self-management through the lens of understanding yourself and understanding what are the things that might be barriers. And a lot of the time it's about taking a frank look at your own mental health, and am I coping or am I not coping? And if I'm not coping, then I need to look at that and I need to sort that out and I need the support to do that. And something that's interesting is that often when she's essentially selling her program to executives, she often says that still there's a perception in the room that this is kind of a very expensive HR exercise, that this is something that, okay, cool, let's do that. Like you said, let's bring the yoga teacher in, let's bring the free, the free coffee on Wednesdays, whatever it might be. But there's a sort of an expectation on a result. Now, at the same time, to be fair, that's also a fair thing to think, a fair thing to want. If you're going to make an investment in something, you do want it to make your business better, make your people better, make them more resilient. So how do we kind of talk about mental health in this way, where there's a commercial element to it that we have to be cognizant of, and that it does need to in some way deliver a result, but then also fair to the process by looking at it as that, well, it's also going to be its own organic kind of thing that needs to account for the diversity of your people, of the human brain, of the human experience. Is there a way that you kind of bridge those two things?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think that it kind of it's the very messy nature of being a human, right? And being a human that is in a workplace that needs to be productive. And so I think that also gets at what I'm seeing a lot is the conversation around mental health and mental illness, which people are separating. So we're starting to talk more about mental health. We're starting to see that that's something that we need to focus on in businesses. But this messy mental illness piece, that's the diagnosed disability where people have higher needs, have higher medical needs, maybe accommodation needs, that's still kind of in this box that we don't know how to deal with. So I think there's this larger part that we can kind of, I guess, see an outcome that's positive if we're starting to bake it into the strategy, if we have a good benefit system, if we have psychological safety in that culture. You will see less people leaving, you'll see less people leaving because the culture is not good for them. You'll see absenteeism and presenteeism go down. You'll see people using less of your benefits, so you're saving money there. But then we have to also acknowledge that there are people with higher needs that absolutely can do a great job, but they need more support. It might cost more money. You might need to have those harder conversations more frequently. And that's where I think that that's that next level that we need to get to. And I think that that's a really hard thing for people. And that the disability world is still continuing to fight to show. Actually, October is National Disability Employment Awareness Month. And to show that with the right resources and accommodations, you have all these brilliant minds and diverse minds and minds that might be more innovative in some ways that we're missing out on. So that, I think, we need to think about things like flexible work schedules, all of those larger pieces that maybe you don't think are helpful to your bottom line, but in the end, what if they're great innovators and they make you a product that makes you $1 million, $1 billion? But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great way to make a case for it, for sure. I suppose it also relates to kind of the movement. Perhaps there's a better way to define it. You'll know far better than I will. But the movement that surrounds the DEI conversation, right? Diversity, equity, inclusion. And from what I've seen and what I've read, and I'm obviously not based in America, so and I know that there's a sort of a narrative around that. But from what I've seen, what I've read, there's some really good progress that's been made there. But there also seems to be a massive kind of pushback against that, whether it's explicit or implicit. I think that you'll have a lot of people who might, on paper, be all for it, but then have totally different views. In private. Is there something you can say to someone who might think that is just a token system, and that it's kind of just it's not really helping us close in on the bottom line, let's say? Is there a different way of kind of defining what diversity, equity, and inclusion can be to someone who is not convinced, or doesn't understand the mental health conversation that should be taking place?
Yes. Here in America, we're in a very tricky spot right now with DEI, and with our election coming up, it is a big talking point. Um, I very much stand on the DEI side. That's kind of the work that I do. And I think one of the things that I just like to remind people is our country is getting more and more diverse. We racially, we have more generations in the workforce. We have our younger generation, Gen Z, is talking much more about neurodivergence, are being much more open about mental health, much more open about their needs. And ultimately, that's going to be our workforce coming in. So if we don't change with the times, unfortunately, we're not going to progress in the way that we want to. Now, that's another piece. There's a lot of folks that might not want to progress, but I think that that's the direction that our younger generation is going. And so if we want to move forward in that progress, I don't like thinking about it in the money sense, but if we're trying to change certain minds, you got to get with the times to make the money, because they are caring about the mission of a company, who they're buying from. They are caring about advertising and what's actually behind the marketing. Is the marketing diverse? These things are really mattering to that generation, and it's just going to continue in that direction, I believe.
Yeah, I think what you said, especially about Gen Z as the kind of the current young people of the day. Used to be millennials. I'm a millennial, so I'm kind of starting to feel old.
Same.
but and in many ways, I think some of that was sort of started by a millennial sensibility around understanding, for example, what's behind marketing, or if I've got an influencer I follow, it's important for me to know what their values are, and if they speak for me, not just because they're sponsoring a product that I might care about or not. It's about, do the values speak to me? Has the way that they've been able to come up to me in my feed, how was that constructed? I want to understand the mechanics of these things, and I think Gen Zs are certainly taking that further, which is great. Which I think definitely speaks to the idea of knowledge is power. But at the same time, you've still got a lot of people in whether it's in politics and business and government, pretty much all sort of centers of power, which are in the hands of older generations. And so there's definitely kind of that disconnect in a way, where the values are different and the value systems governing those decisions are different. That's not to say there's a whole lot of gray in the middle, and that, it's obviously, in a way, we're sort of generalizing, but it does have that effect, which is interesting. How do you think about the kind of the generational element in this conversation as well, and where that makes sense for you?
I think that we need to, when we think about technology in the workplace, I think that we need to think about the digital natives. We need to think about people that didn't grow up with the internet, and how can we all come together to work together, to know that we all have this diverse perspective of how we move forward. And that's an inclusion piece in itself. I think that people miss that we have to think about all of the needs of people. It's not just, people of color or LGBTQ or neurodiversity, but, the older generations are baby boomers who might not have grown up with the tech that Gen Z just knows how to use. So all of that, it helps everyone when we're trying to be inclusive in that way. And this is probably where I'm going to lose jobs. But if we go back, there were a lot of white men, and there still are, that are in those places of power. And now women can vote and women can do more. We're seeing more people of color in power. We still have so much further to go. But if we want to move forward and see this diversity progress, people are going to have to give up. It's that fear of giving up power, I think, that is unfortunately keeping us back. And the fear of the unknown, the fear that it's going to be different if you're someone of privilege. I'm someone of privilege, and it's going to be different for me as well. But we have to think about what we want for the greater good, We have to think about things that might not just be for me, but how do we make it better for our kids and those coming into the workforce? And, it's tricky. But then, I mean, when I talk about mental health and I talk about diversity and how within the mental health world, all of the so many different people have different needs. We think about actual mental health treatments or resources. We might look at the Black community and them not getting this kind of resources, or the LGBTQ community not getting this resource. But we also have to think that white men have the highest suicide rate in a lot of places. So it's all of us. It's not that white people are discluded from this conversation, because there are different needs there as well, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. And I think it's refreshing to think that we all have needs, regardless of what background we have, whose parents, we came from, how much money we grew up with, whatever it might be. We all are human in that way. And so it's nice to think of the fact that we're all similar when we're different. I think that's reassuring and a great way to kind of think about the diversity that we have and why it's worth celebrating. When you're thinking also about the centers of power you're talking about, especially the fact that not traditionally, I would argue probably since the Stone Age, it has been, in the hands of older white men who have controlled, the means to production, if you like. That has, I suppose, been a route to being able to make money, to have economic progress through that, whether it's building industry, whether it's technology, whether it's making changes in politics. There's always going to be a financial element. So I suppose part of the conversation around diversity and inclusion is being able to make sure that side of things, the economic side of things, or the progress that the world needs to make, is not lost in the conversation, which is what you were saying. Even though we don't necessarily want to talk about it, the money side is important, and that still plays a role, whether or not we like it. So I suppose that's the hard part of this conversation. Being able to address that, but not let it take over the whole conversation, as so often it does.
Mm-hmm. And then it gets tricky because a capitalist society is built to reinforce that racism and that larger piece. So how do we get that messy conversation? These are the conversations people don't want to have because it's scary. You're worried you're going to say the wrong thing, but this is also how we grow and try to problem solve and acknowledge what's happening. And then, okay, now what do we do to move forward? If we still need to make money, we still need to have the society where we can work together. That's a larger answer that I'm still trying to figure out. Yeah. But one thing that I do know is that I don't want to just be silent about it anymore, because that's part of what I need to talk about, that we can't talk about mental health and not talk about these things.
Yes, absolutely. And so that's why, I'm really enjoying the conversation, because it's kind of getting into the meat of some of those areas that are difficult to talk about. And that I, on this podcast, talking to you, talking to other people, when we have conversations, I always try and find those areas which I think are discussions that are not being had in some way. And even if it's messy in some way, it's okay, as long as there's a space. It's a start that we're making. We're making a start. It's definitely not perfect, but at least it's taking place. Because I think that also being silent or kind of feeling that we're almost censored into silence in a way is also not the right way to do it, where there's almost a kind of an infringement on the ability for us to talk openly about it. But of course, then that means that then there's going to be some feelings that are hurt as well. So I suppose I'm talking about free speech in a sense. Where do you sit on kind of free speech? What do you think about that?
Well, it's tricky. I don't think that we should have hateful speech that's going to essentially put people in danger. But I think having these conversations is very important. I think having it in a way that we are respectful of one another and aware of other people's needs and perspectives as best we can. Um, it's a really tricky one.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the things, as I'm sitting in this conversation with you, and I feel nervous having these conversations. I could be a white woman that sits quiet, like keeps my mouth shut and not, just have my privilege and not address these things. I'm probably saying a lot of things wrong, but that's going to be how it goes. And
Right.
I think that's that piece when we were talking earlier about how do we have a difficult conversation. You're a very good active listener. I'm trying to listen. We're having this ability to, I think, really care for one another in this conversation, even though we don't know each other very well. Trying to operate from that sense that we're just trying to build this relationship and learn more about how we can help the world and one another. And so I'm trying to, as nervous as I am talking about these things, I know that we're doing our best to make progress to help other people, right?
Yeah, definitely. That's absolutely my intention, and I know it's yours too. And in doing that, in the discovery and the learning and finding out these things together, you're going to navigate, parts of it which you don't know how to talk about. And I suppose that's where the language comes in, right? Because language also has such a sort of a subtle but powerful way of informing how we think. If I use a certain word, it's going to immediately put a picture in your mind. It puts a picture in my mind, and a lot of the time those pictures are different, obviously, but it immediately sort of grounds the conversation in the kinds of words I'm using. Do you have some other kind of, maybe some thoughts on language and how you maybe advise other people to sort of, if they're also having tough conversations or they don't know how to approach a conversation about something, but they feel they need to talk about it? What are some good tips on how to think about the kinds of words I should use, and how to make best use of language?
I think acknowledging being vulnerable in that space, like I just did, saying, I really want to talk about this. I don't know how. I'm probably going to say something wrong and I'm nervous, but I would love for you to let me know if there is some way I could say something better, if there is something that I can learn or grow from. Here's here's what I want to talk about or my issue. And like, what do you need to express? Or is there a way that I could have expressed it better? I think it's all a conversational piece as much as you can. Obviously, writing in the internet makes things a lot different, but when we can have those conversations one-on-one is really good.
Absolutely. And you're so right about the vulnerability. There's a beautiful conversation between Simon Sinek and Trevor Noah. I'm not sure if you've seen it online.
I haven't.
It's so worth it. Just beautiful. They're talking about the value of friendship and just all sorts of awesome things. And one of the things that Simon said was that you don't build trust by you don't build trust by offering help. You build it by asking for it. And it just kind of stopped me in my tracks, like, what? But it just makes sense, doesn't it? Because and it's funny because if I reflect in my own kind of experience, I'm always the first person to raise my hand if someone needs help. I love helping people. It's what I do, just like you. Perhaps it's great. Help is its own reward. But I'm normally the very last person to ask for it. I don't ask for it. I should probably ask for it a whole lot more, especially when I need to. And there's a vulnerability resistance there. It's because I'm always, I love helping someone, especially if they're vulnerable in front of me, but I don't necessarily give them the kind of the privilege of that experience, if you like, of me being vulnerable with them and thus being able to form that trust. So you're right, being vulnerable or being able to access a sense of vulnerability and put that in the middle and say, look, I don't know what's going on here, but I'm just letting you know how I feel about it, but I want to proceed, is such a great way of opening the dialogue for hard conversations.
And then I think being open to continue the conversation, because it might not all be fixed in one time. And so it's that continued vulnerability, that continued, okay, last time we talked about this and I learned this, and maybe we need a little time to catch our breath or heal a little bit, and then maybe have another conversation where we can be vulnerable again and open and just have that continued relationship building, right?
Yeah, because it takes place over time, and I suppose
Mm-hmm.
there's a reinforcement of that space that needs to happen more than once. Yeah. Is there something you can say, or even if it's advice or recommendation you can give to someone who might be listening, who knows or thinks of themselves in some way as, neurodivergent in some way, um, that might be listening to this conversation and thinking, okay, it's great that that these guys are trying to find a space to talk about these things, but how can I, as a person who has slightly different needs in some way, navigate it? Is there a way that you can kind of recommend to someone who's on that side to sort of help them with their colleagues to sort of, okay, guys, this is what I need, and this is how you can deal with me in a different way? Or is it about, thinking about inclusivity in a different way?
I I think the first thing I would say is your needs are 100% valid, that the world was not necessarily built for you. And so it's valid if you're struggling, if you have needs that you feel aren't being met. Um, know that it's not in your head. You're not crazy. Your needs are valid. And there's nothing wrong with asking for support and asking for accommodations and help for this world that might not be set up for you. Sometimes it doesn't feel safe to do that or to disclose. And so it's important to find that found family, find people that can help support you. I was really lucky to have my family who could be my advocate when I couldn't. So knowing that if you can build a community and have an advocate that can be there with you, that's really, really powerful. And that there are resources out there. There is a huge community waiting for you if you haven't found them yet, that have tons of tricks and tools and are ready for you with open arms. So if you don't find your space, maybe in your work group or in your workplace, that it is there and that your needs are valid.
Beautiful.
One of the things that I've been really actually building off of kind of what I was saying, what I would say to someone with that, is neurodiverse. One of the things I've been really excited about and working on lately is talking more about assistive technology for mental health. And assistive technology is essentially any tool or technology or system that can help you in your work, in your daily life, that may help you with needs that you have. And people think about assistive tech like captions, or they might think about Braille, or they might think about, a cane, but they don't think about it for mental health. And so for me, I've been really talking about what I use and the things that are helpful for me, because I found that this is such a needed conversation, talking about the importance of a weighted blanket and how that makes a huge help, or when I'm traveling, making sure I have noise canceling headphones. So that's one of the things that I've kind of been talking about a lot more, and I'm excited it's becoming part of this conversation. When we talk about the needs of people in the workplace that are neurodiverse, there's so many tools and things that we can use that can help us, just function better, be our true authentic selves, because we have the tools and tricks and technologies that can support us.
Yes. Yeah. Are there just on the subject of tools, are there any sort of AI tools in that kind of checklist that are there that might be worth mentioning? Because, obviously everyone's got an interest in AI,
Yeah.
because we're thinking about it all the time. Yeah.
One of the tools that I just actually sat down with a friend. We're both neurodiverse, and we were actually just sharing what apps that we like to use. And The one I found lately, it's called Goblin Tools. And when I'm really overwhelmed and I'm like, oh, I can't clean the house because it just feels so heavy, you can put it in and it will break down. You can actually make it so it breaks down 1 to 5 spiciness. So you can have a full extensive list of literally like, get your cleaning products, get this ready, or just room to room. And then she was telling me about one, I think it's called One Sec, where she was saying that it will kind of stop you from using certain apps. It'll make you take a pause and breathe or do some kind of activity. Say, if you want to open up TikTok and you find that you get stuck doom scrolling too often, you can put this app so it'll stop you from opening it and take a second to say, do I actually want to open it? I use focus mode on my phone, on my computer. Microsoft Office has that as a built-in. There's so many tools and technology. And I think AI is just going to continue to make it better and better.
Yeah, no doubt. Absolutely. Yeah, those sound awesome. I wanted to ask you, are there any kind of cases where you're seeing, a healthy way of talking and engaging subjects around neurodivergence outside of America, maybe in Europe or in Asia or anywhere else, where there's been a fresh take or a fresh angle that's been explored there, which is kind of made you think, oh, that would be useful if we did that in the States? Or would you say that things are maybe behind in some way?
The first thing that comes to mind is the use of identity versus person first language. So in the disability world, these are 2 different kinds of ways you might talk about a disability. So identity first might be, I'm a bipolar woman. So you put the bipolar first, versus person first is a woman with bipolar. And I know that in a lot of European countries, they're using identity first. In the US, we use person first. So in our, government agencies, a lot of nonprofits, we're saying person with a disability, person with bipolar. And I think that this started because of a very important thing, which was we didn't want to say like the mentally ill or things that were more discriminatory. Yeah. But in, for example, the deaf community or the autistic community, they prefer identity first because it's flipped it around on this almost pride piece. It's a part of me. It's when I first started dealing with my mental health, I was told to use person first because I have bipolar, but it's not who I am. That you kind of separate it. Like, I'm a person with bipolar. The bipolar is over here. But as I learned more about, the pride piece, like mad pride and disability pride, I realized, oh, this is this really integrated part of me. I am a bipolar woman. And that's something that's already being used in a lot of other countries. So it's just interesting to think about kind of just that alone in terms of language. It's very personal preference. So I know for a lot of people, it's very helpful to have that person first, but it's just an interesting conversation.
Definitely. I can see how that would be something that allows someone to really embrace the fullness of who they are, whether, it's a feature or a bug, it's all part of who they are, and that's okay. And it's also obviously a personal choice. So it needs to be about where that's comfortable for them. But yeah, I mean, I think that's cool. Yeah. You got me thinking. Interesting.
And just an example of how little things in language we might think about can make such a huge impact and have so much behind them.
Totally. Yeah, exactly. When we look at, I know that you speak a little bit about disability rights as well. I just for a moment, I was kind of um, taken back to a moment. I think I was about 18 or 19, a long time ago, back in South Africa, where I used to live. And I remember helping someone across the road, actually pushing them in their wheelchair, someone that I knew. And we were talking about she had an accident a long time ago, and and we were talking about how she might like to, how she refers herself to being disabled or being handicapped. And I actually asked her, I actually provided a few different options when I asked her, like, do you think of yourself as disabled, handicapped, differently abled? I mean, and there's so many different ways to talk about it. And at the time when I asked her this, I had my own preconception in my mind that disabled is kind of almost the most offensive part, or the most offensive way I could be referring, or that she could be talking about this sort of disabled. There's a kind of an edginess to the word. And she said to me, no, I am disabled. And that's it, and that you don't need to kind of fluff around and sort of give me all of these other alternatives. That's not how I think about it, that I'm a disabled person, and I sit in a wheelchair, and that's it, and it kind of gave me and we had a great conversation after that. But I've always taken away from that there really is a balance, it seems, which is always based on personal preference, yes, but maybe at a social level where there is something to be said about language that cuts to the core of what it is, and that isn't padded by needless euphemisms just because there may be some people who do find that offensive. Okay, fine. And then go ahead and correct that. But it doesn't mean that it should be stamped out altogether necessarily, because like she told me, that's what it is, and there isn't anything inside of the word that is offensive on its own. What do you think about that?
That's the power of words. When we act like they're a bad thing, what we're actually showing is that we think disability is something that maybe we shouldn't talk about, or that it's a bad thing. We try to make a cutesy term that instead infantilizes, which is a problem that's already happening. Yes. And if we just name it, it's another part of me. I have brown hair, I have bipolar. It takes away that negativity, that ableism we don't even realize is creeping in. I just gave a presentation on actually what's called inspiration porn. And it was a TED talk that was given, oh my gosh, I am forgetting her name right now. I literally just gave this. Stella Young gave the most incredible TED talk on the term she coined, inspiration porn, where essentially she's a little person in a wheelchair, and she was nominated for some award because essentially, she was disabled and existed, and the world thought that she was inspiring. And she's like, all that I was really good at as a teen was watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer, just existing. And so just that concept that simply in getting out of bed, we're so inspiring, or going to the grocery store can be inspiring. And certainly there are amazing things that people can do that are inspiring, but it's that attachment that because we have a disability, that it's something that's amazing and inspiring, when in fact it's just a human piece. So I think a lot about words around disability, a lot about the tropes that come with it, and just naming it, because disability is not a bad word, right? It's just, I'm a woman, I have a disability, I have brown hair, I'm white. Those are just pieces of who I am. And yeah, so it's hard though, because there's this history of just this policy naming, or within the diagnostic manuals, we've had to change language a lot. And I think some people also have a reclaiming. So who's saying what words and who has the right to say what words? That's also a complication of the process. I know mad pride and super crip are words that I think some people are uncomfortable, but it's a reclaiming for others.
Okay. Yeah. It's complex, and it's so interesting to explore it. It's really sociology, if you think about it. It's just how we're interacting, and the tools of language to help us to hopefully simplify difficult situations, but sometimes they can also get us into complicating them as well.
But I think that what you did with your friend is exactly right. Don't make a big deal. Just ask what you prefer. And if we don't make a big deal about it, we can just say, hey, do you prefer this term or this term? And then we can move on.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. She schooled me. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on and giving us a lot to think about when it comes to language and what it means to be inclusive, and thinking about some of the dynamics in the workplace in I think quite a fresh way. Really appreciated the conversation.
Thanks for letting me cover such a broad range of topics. It was wonderful to talk to you. It's obviously something I'm really passionate about. So
yeah, I can see. Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, and really happy that you're part of the community too. So
absolutely.
Appreciate it. Good stuff. Thanks for listening to this episode of Humble Mind. I hope you enjoyed it. If you're curious to take a look at our community, if you're not a member, you're missing out. Make sure you head to humblemind.co to check out more and to see what we're up to. I look forward to seeing you there. Until next time.